Hello, in this video I will explain how central banks and supervisors factor in climate risk. The approach is threefold. First, how financial institutions manage climate risk. Second, measuring and identifying the risks related to climate change. And third, raising climate risks awareness among financial institutions. The Prudential Supervision and Resolution Authority's role is to monitor the risks hanging over the French banking and insurance sector. We specifically want to work on certain emerging risks, including climate risk. In terms of climate risk management, our work is fourfold. First, the strategy. The goal here is to make sure that financial institutions include climate risks in their policy framework. This means defining goals and implementing indicators, both robust and verifiable, in order to monitor whether these goals are met or not. Publishing this information ensures markets and customers that the institution is following through on its strategic commitments. Regarding the strategy, we also lean on the allocation, definition, and distribution of climate-related responsibilities within the Executive Committee. Second, we lean on institutions' internal organization, ensuring that the climate-related responsibilities are clearly distributed within decision-making bodies. We also aim for internal organization and for climate risk to be considered as a financial risk, and as such, regularly monitored by the various departments. We want to maintain consistency between departments in charge of CSR, meaning social, governmental, and environmental responsibility, and of risk management or legal issues. So we ensure that institutions resort to all human technical means and train their agents to factor in climate risk. The third axis of this governance-related corpus is for climate risks to be factored in as another financial risk. This usually means defining these risks and including them in the risk appetite framework characterizing the institution's risk profile. It also relates to the way climate risks can impact other major supervised risks, such as operational risk, market risk, counterparty risk, or credit risk. We also ensure that indicators or approaches, at least qualitative ones, and if possible, quantitative ones, are developed to measure these risks. We also try to include a forward-looking dimension with the use of scenarios. The last axis is about financial institutions' external communication and publications, either required or voluntary, such as TCFD-related publications, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures working on voluntary publications by institutions. One of the purposes of this voluntary approach is to highlight the integration of forward-looking elements in the form of climate change risks analysis scenarios. The second axis for supervisors and central banks is about measuring and identifying climate change-related risks. We use four main types of tools. First, questionnaires or surveys to measure risks faced by financial institutions. For banks, it may be related to their credit activity, for insurance, to investments, or insurance policies. The second axis is about monitoring and evaluating climate risk public commitment.
portant sur le risque climatique.
They may be commitments to divest certain sectors such as coal. They can also be policies leading to divestment in some sectors or help customers with their transition.
Des politiques qui conduisent à désinvestir de certains secteurs ou accompagner la clientèle dans la transition.
The third tool for supervisors is inspection and monitoring the way firms are working to factor in climate risk.
Les firmes sont organisées pour intégrer le risque climatique.
Either assessing management or risk models used by these institutions to measure climate risk. The last axis is the use of data from institutions' regulatory reporting.
Des reportings réglementaires auxquels sont soumis les institutions.
Over the past 6 years, in terms of regulatory reporting, we have observed a strong increase in requirements, especially in France and in Europe. In France, the first regulation appeared in 2015 with the Law on Energy Transition and Green Growth, with Article 173 imposing certain environmental, social, and governance requirements.
Qui porte sur les dimensions environnementales, sociales et de gouvernance.
Specifically, it includes information on climate change risks.
Sur le risque de changement climatique.
This law mainly applies to financial companies that manage assets for their customers.
Qui assurent la gestion d'actifs pour le compte de leur clientèle.
This first law was updated and completed in 2019 by the Energy Climate Law, and its Article 29 replacing Article 173. And adding the European regulation aspect while preserving the benefits and further requirements requested by the French authorities.
Et en y ajoutant notamment des dimensions relatives à la réglementation européenne, tout en préservant les acquis et les exigences supplémentaires demandées par les autorités françaises.
We specifically develop more requirements to generate information on climate risk.
Supplémentaires en matière de production d'informations sur le risque climatique.
And in relation to what Benoît Lequet was saying in a previous video, this information must be categorized by nature of risk, either physical risks, transition risks, or legal risks.
Les risques physiques, les risques de transition et les risques qui sont liés aux poursuites juridiques auxquelles pourraient être exposés les établissements.
French dispositions are supplemented by European ones, especially since May 2021. The European Regulation on the Publication of Sustainable Finance-Related Information. Its main contribution is to include the notion of double materiality. Institutions are asked to produce information about the potential impact of climate change on their activity and the potential impact of financial institutions, banks, and insurance companies specifically on the environment and on climate change. The third axis used by central banks and supervisors to better factor in climate risk is raising awareness among financial institutions. Many reasons may explain why financial institutions struggle to factor in climate risk. The first one is the uncertainties about the extent and rate of climate change with nonlinear phenomena, and specifically, irreversible effects on climate change. The second difficulty is the lack of data, especially from companies, which make it difficult to truly measure the risks faced by financial institutions. The third one is the complexity of transmission channels. To facilitate things, the ACPR launched a climatic stress test. It's the first time a supervising authority subjects the institutions under its control, i.e. banks and insurers, to this type of exercise. What's a stress test? It is usually used by supervisors to measure their ability to absorb macroeconomic and financial shocks. These tests usually focus on the short terms, 3 to 5 years, with strong negative assumptions. They can be consecutive recession years along with financial shocks, such as asset price reductions, real estate price reductions, global recessions, etc. In the case of this pilot exercise, the climatic stress test, they are conducted in different conditions. First, the long term must be integrated to reflect the transition. These exercises take a time horizon of 30 years long, compared to 3 to 5 years. These exercises also factor in the universality of the shocks, since climate change is a global phenomenon affecting various countries worldwide. They also factor in sector specificity, since transition shocks affect industries in very different ways. For the ACPR pilot exercise, we leaned on the following hypotheses. First, long-term horizons, i.e. the 2020 to 2050 period on French insurers and banks. With these two sectors, we usually look at their potential interactions in terms of climate change considerations. The second important dimension is the universality, since shocks affect countries worldwide. This international dimension also illustrates that French actors are active worldwide. The third characteristic of this risk is a sectorial approach. The activity was divided into 55 sectors. For each scenario, each geographic area, we factor in 55 activity sectors. One of the innovations of the ACPR exercise is to use one additional assumption, the behavioral one, called the dynamic balance assumption. In this assumption, financial institutions may change the structure of their record to factor in changes that may be related to the emergence of certain climate risks. Our exercise is about the transition risk and the physical risk. About the transition risk, we leaned on 3 scenarios, 2 of which come from the central banks and supervisors' networks, the NGFS that Morgan Desprez presented. Here are the 3 scenarios. The reference scenario is a so-called orderly scenario. It reflects the low-carbon national strategy as implemented by the French authorities. It's an orderly scenario based on assumptions of a relatively soft transition, with a limited carbon price increase and technological progress to encourage the transition. Besides this reference scenario, we chose 2 disorderly transition scenarios. The first one, that of a late NGFS transition, is where authorities take belated transition measures, such as increasing the carbon tax, for instance. And these measures are only adopted by 2030, but relatively abruptly, thus translating into an economic and financial shock. The third scenario is a brutal transition, i.e. a stronger carbon price increase. In our scenarios, we assume an increase of $14 to $900 per ton of carbon by 2050. In this exercise, we have withdrawn all positive transition assumptions. In addition to these transition scenarios, we also factor in the physical risk, leaning on the least favorable IPCC scenario. This scenario assumes a temperature rise around 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial era by 2100. We worked on this scenario leaning on the Central Reassurance Fund, which is the organization in charge of the natural disaster regime in France, and Meteo France, allowing us to reach a granular level, i.e. working with insurers and the Central Reinsurance Fund on physical risk measurements on the municipal level. and including risks related to floods, droughts, coastal flooding, and tropical storms for the overseas territories.
Et pour les départements d'outre-mer, les tempêtes tropicales.
We also include the health factor, related to the increased frequency and duration of heat waves. The main results of this pilot climate exercise were published last May. First, they show a relatively moderate level of exposure of French banks and insurers to climate risks. They also highlight a certain number of methodological difficulties, especially regarding institutions' ability to factor in long-term horizons in their various internal approaches and in risk measurement processes. They are also about their ability to include the sectorial dimension of the risk in models which usually do not factor it in. The last difficulty that institutions face is the integration of a physical dimension, because banks still struggle to specifically locate their exposures, i.e. the private or business loans. And insurers assume that the increased cost of extreme climate events can be supported by the customers only. But in some areas, the ×5, ×6 multiplication of the cost of these extreme climate events leads us to wonder if households actually can support such insurance premium increases. This video was about the central banks and supervisors' approach. The next video will be a specific case study and the implementation of the various approaches which banks can take, especially the AFD.